Hey there, how's it going everybody? In this video, we're going to be learning how to get started with using Python and the YouTube API. So this will allow us to connect to YouTube's API to gather information from YouTube and do some analysis from within Python. Now, there are a lot of things that I've used this for in the past. So for example, I've used this API to tally up the total duration of specific playlists, to track channel subscriptions, to do some analysis on trending videos, and also to grab the most popular video from specific playlists and things like that. And I'll make videos for all of those topics in the near future. But before we do that, we'll need to get started by creating an API key and connecting to Google's API in Python. So that's what we're going to be doing in this video. We'll learn how to create an API key, how to find all the information that we need in the documentation, and also make some simple API requests to make sure that everything is working properly. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, we're going to need to sign up for an API key in order for us to use the YouTube API. So to do this, I'm going to navigate to my developers console over here on Google to get set up with all of this information. So this is at console.developers.google.com. And I'll have links to all of these sites in the description section below. Now, when you navigate to this page, it could look slightly different than mine, depending on whether or not you've already created a project. I've deleted my previous project before this video so that I can start from scratch. So if you haven't created a project yet, then you should see a page that looks something like this. So we should see a prompt over here on the far right for creating a new project. And all you need to do is click on that and then give your project a name. So for my name here, I'm just going to type in YouTube API and then I will create. And once we have a project created, it should look something like this. So first of all, Google has a lot of APIs. And if this video is interesting to all of you, then we can explore some of the other APIs available to us through Google as well. But we're wanting to use the YouTube API for this video. So we need to enable this API before creating our key. So to do this, we can see that it says we don't have any APIs available yet to use and that we need to enable one. So I'm just going to go to their API library here. And now we can search for an API. So I'm just going to search for YouTube. And we can see that we get a few different results here. The one that I'm going to be using is going to be the YouTube Data API. So I'm going to click on that. And then we will enable this. And now that we've enabled the use of this API for our project, now we can create an API key. To do this, it's linking us to a page up here that says Create Credentials. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And then it's going to ask us a couple of questions here about our what kind of credentials we need. So which API are we using? We've only enabled one, so I'm going to choose YouTube Data API. Where will you be calling the API from? I am going to be using, let's see, I'm just going to pick other non-UI cron job daemon here at the bottom, since I'm just going to be running this from a Python script. But if you're running it from a web browser or a web server, then you can select whatever option you're going to be using it for. But I'm going to go for non-UI here. And now we have this question, what data will you be accessing? So now it's going to ask us what type of credentials we want to create. We can either create an API key, which is used to access public information from YouTube, and that's what we'll be doing in this video. Or we can create an OAuth client, which is used for accessing private information from an account if a user is properly authenticated. So that would be user data here. Now in this video, we're just accessing public information that anyone can find on YouTube. So I'm going to click on public data. And now we can click on what credentials do I need? And it should go ahead and tell us that we just need an API key and go ahead and give us our API key here. Now you can see here that there's also that they recommend restricting this key before it's used in production. So you can restrict a key to like a single IP address or a couple of different other options there. I'm not going to do that in this video because I'm just going to delete this API key after this video is done. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And now I'm going to click on Done. Okay, so now we've created our API key. And on this page, it will show us all of the keys I have available for this project. So we can see that I have one API key here, and that if I need to copy this again, then I can just click this right here to copy this key. And again, don't worry, I'm going to delete this API key after this video, so you don't have to worry about anyone stealing this or anything like that. Now I know that I'm going to be using this API key later within my Python script, so I'm going to go ahead and paste this into my empty script for later use. And this is the script that I'm going to be using to write the code to connect to the API later. So I'm going to just paste that here within a string. Now, for the purpose of making things easy for this video, I'm just going to have this API key directly in my script here. But when you work with APIs, you definitely want to keep these secret. If someone gets a hold of your API key, then they'll be able to access the API service on your behalf. So if you ever think that an API key is lost or stolen, then you'll need to delete it and create a new one. Now, one way to keep these tokens and passwords safe is to put them in an environment variable or a secret configuration file that isn't committed to any of your repositories. And I have a video on using environment variables for secret keys. So if you'd like to see what that looks like, then I'll leave a link to that video in the description section below. Okay, so now that we have our API key, we're ready to use the YouTube API using Python. Now, I mentioned this in my last video when I worked with the Patreon API, but the documentation for these APIs are going to be our best friend when developing anything like this. Luckily, Google has some terrific documentation for their YouTube API. Now, to find this, you could just do a Google, a simple Google search for YouTube API, but instead of the first result that you'd find on Google that takes you to their official documentation, I'm instead going to open their Python client GitHub documentation for now. Now, I find this to be extremely useful since it has all the methods and arguments that we're going to be able to use within Python, and they're all listed here. Now, I've got this page pulled up in my browser already, but like I said, I'll be sure to link all of these pages in the description section below so that you can find them all right. Okay, so this is the GitHub page here, and you can see that this is the Google API's user, and this is the Google API client for Python. And I think they did a great job of documenting everything here so that it allows us to work with this API easily. Now, if we scroll down, then it will give us some installation instructions here. If I scroll down to installation, then it's going to tell us what we need to pip install in order to work with this API. So this is the package that we need to install here, Google API Python Client, and that's the same on Windows. Now they're showing you how to activate a virtual environment. Now you don't have to use a virtual environment in order to install this, but I always recommend using these since it's just a good practice to use a different environment for each project. Now, if you'd like to learn more about virtual environments, then I'll be sure to leave a link to my video on that topic in the description section below as well. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and install this Google API Python client using pip. Now, I've already got a virtual environment activated here. So I'm just going to say pip install and install this Google API Python client. So let's go ahead and install that. Okay, so once that's finished installing, let's go back to the browser and I'll show how we can use the documentation to see exactly what we need in order to work with this API correctly. So I've got the browser back open here. Now I'm going to scroll up here to the top and we can see here that it says to get started, see the docs folder. So I'm going to open up this docs folder in a new tab here. And then I'm going to scroll down here to the bottom and click on Getting Started. And now let's take a look at what we need to get started using this API. So we can see here that we've already done some of this. So it tells us that if we don't have a Google account, that we need to create one, that we need to go to our Google API console and create a project and things like that. We need to create an API key. We've already done all of this. So now that we have our API key, we can go down here to building and calling a service. This is the step that we are currently at. So let me go ahead and read this real quick. So it says that this section describes how to build an API specific service object, make calls to the service, and process the response. Whether you are using a simple or authorized API access, you can use the build function to create a service object. It takes an API name and API version as arguments. You can see the list of all API versions at the supported APIs page. The service object is constructed with methods specific to that given API. So to create it, you can do the following. Okay, so we can see that we need to use this build function here, and we need to pass in the API name and the API version. Let me go ahead and open up this build function here and see what this looks like. So let me make this browser a little larger so that you all can see. So we can see that we have this build function here, and we need the service name, we need the version for that service, and then we can see here that it also takes in a developer key. So the developer key is our API key. So let me go back here. So we need to know our service name and version in order to connect to a specific API. And to find this, they have the supported APIs page listed here for us so that we can find the one that we're looking for. So I'm going to open this up in a new tab. And if I look at this, then these are all their APIs and API versions. Now, instead of searching through this entire thing, I'm just going to do a search for YouTube here. So YouTube is the service name, and we can see that it's all lowercase, and version 3 is the version. Now, if I click on this v3 here, I'm going to open this up in a new tab. These are actually all of the instance methods available to us once we connect to this YouTube service. So I'm going to leave this page open here so that we can reference this later. But now I'm going to go back here to this building the service object. So they actually show us here how to connect to a service by importing this build function and then passing in all of that information that we just saw within the documentation. And we'll need to pass in our API key into that function as well. So I'm going to copy this import statement here and paste this into our script. So I'm going to copy that, go back to the script, and let's import this at the top. Okay, and now from reading that documentation, we know that we can connect to the YouTube service by using this build function. So I'm going to call this service YouTube, and then I will pass in the build function, and that was first we need to pass in the service name, which was YouTube, all lowercase, and then the version was v3, and then it also took in developer key as an argument as well, and that is our API key. And again, if you're ever working with an API and forget any of this information, then you can always go back to the documentation just to be sure. Okay, so we have our YouTube service here, and if we typed everything incorrectly, then this should be ready to use. So real quick, let's test this by making a very simple API request. So I'm just going to fetch my channel information from YouTube and see if I get a response. Now, in order to know how to do this, we can go back to the documentation and look at the instance methods available to us with this YouTube service. So I'm going to go back to the documentation here and open back up where we had, where we clicked on this YouTube version 3, and it gave us all of our instance methods here that are available to us. And we can see here towards the top of these instance methods that we have one called channels. So we have this channels method, and that returns a resource for that API route. So if I open this in a new tab, then we can see that the resource that we have a few more methods here. Now, the one that I'm going to be interested in is this list method so that we can list specific channels. And we can see the arguments that this list method takes. So we need to pass in this part argument here, which is basically the information that we want included in the response. Now look, I know that we're probably sick of looking at documentation instead of actually writing some code here, but I'm trying to give a realistic example of what it's like to actually learn how to work with these APIs. There's a lot of different information to track down. So the last bit of information that we need right now is what we can actually pass in as an argument for this part parameter here. And then we'll be able to make our first API request. So to find this information, I'm just going to open up the official API documentation. So right now we're on the Google API for Python GitHub documentation, but I'm going to open up the official YouTube documentation now. And I already have this open in the browser, but if you Google YouTube API, then this will be the first result. Okay, so to find more information about what we can pass in to that channel's resource and what we can get back, we're going to need to click on References up here. And then we want to go down to this channels reference. And remember, I was wanting to list channels. So we could either go to an overview to see an overview of this API route, or I could go to list, which is specifically the route that I'm looking for. And then we can see that it gives us common use cases. We can even take a look at some code here, and they have some Python code examples here. So they did a really good job of documenting all of this. Now, what I need is I need to scroll down to parameters to see what exactly we can pass in to this part, which is a required parameter. So right here, we can see all the strings that we can pass into this part parameter. So let's say that I want the statistics of a certain channel. Then I can just pass in statistics here as an argument. So let me go back to our script and I'll try this out. So I'm going to go back to our script here. And now in order to do this, I can create a request. And then I'm going to use this YouTube service here. And remember, we saw those YouTube, that YouTube resource earlier and all those instance methods that we had available. And one of those was the channels instance method. And within there, we want to list the channels. And now we need to pass in a couple of required parameters. So first, we need to pass in that part. And I said that I was going to look up the statistics for a channel. And finally, how do we find what channel we're actually getting statistics for? So if I go back to the documentation one more time and look at our list method that we're using up here at the top, we can see one here that is for username. So we could either pass in like a channel ID, or we could pass in a channel username using the for username parameter. So that's what I'm going to use. So I'm going to just say for username, and that was a capitalized U, I believe, in that documentation. And now my channel username is actually Schaefer5. Okay, so that should create a request to the YouTube API. But now, in order to get a response, we're going to have to execute that request. So I'll say request.execute. And now let's just print out our response here. So if I save this and run it, then we see that we did get a response here. So if I look at this response, then we can see that I get my, that we had one total result, and that it is a of kind of a YouTube channel. It gives me my channel ID and things like that. And if I look down here at my video count, it says 226. So that sounds about right for my channel. So it does seem like our API connection is working. So if we wanted to see stats for another YouTube channel, then all we need to do is pass in their username here into this function. Now, a username might be different than their display name on YouTube. So for example, my display name is Corey Schaefer, but my username is Schaefer5. To find the username, you'd actually have to go to their YouTube page and then look in the URL. So for example, let's say that I wanted to look up, let's do Syntex's channel. So if I think his username is probably Syntex, but let's go ahead and see if that is correct. I'll save this and run it. And we can see that, yeah, this is probably him because he has 890,000 subscribers, and he's definitely blowing me out of the water with the video count there. He has over 1,200 videos, so that's very impressive. Okay, so now that we know that we have this API working here within Python, now we can use this API to grab just about any public information that we'd want. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next few videos. So I'll show how we can use this API to do some really useful things that aren't directly available from within YouTube itself. So for example, in the next video, we're going to learn how to write a script that calculates the duration of videos in a specific playlist. And I think this is extremely important information to know. And I'm honestly surprised that Google hasn't added this information to the actual playlist data on the actual website. So for example, if you wanted to watch one of my playlists, then you'd likely want to know how long that playlist is so that you can get an idea of how long it would take you to learn that certain topic. But currently, YouTube doesn't have that information directly on their site. So I use scripts like this all the time when I'm trying to calculate information like this to make my life a little bit easier. So definitely be sure to check out that next video when it's released if that sounds like something you'd be interested in. Okay, so I think that is going to do it for this video. Hopefully now you have a pretty good idea for how you can get started with the YouTube API and accessing this information within Python. But if anyone has any questions about what we covered in this video, then feel free to ask in the comment section below.